Hello everybody, this is just a short presentation on thought experiments. Thought experiments are an important part of philosophy. You're probably used to performing thought experiments of some varieties yourself, but sometimes thought experiments in philosophy can engage in what seem to be pretty wild flights of fancy, and sometimes this takes students by surprise. The purpose of this brief presentation, therefore, is to explain to students the purpose and nature of thought experiments and why they are important even when the thought experiment is about something unlikely ever to actually happen. I decided to make this presentation because many students react strangely to thought experiments because they often ask us to imagine situations far outside of our realm of experience. The German word for thought experiment is Gedankenexperiment. You do not need to know the German, of course, but the term is often used in philosophy. In fact, thought experiments, or Gedankenexperiments, are, apart from the methods of logic itself, perhaps, if not the primary tool of Western analytic philosophy, they are certainly a primary tool. But they are not limited to philosophy. Such experiments have helped the sciences advance as well, although it might be argued that when the scientists were engaging in these thought experiments, they were actually engaging in philosophy. Philosophy has been tied with the sciences since its beginnings, and indeed the sciences were once all classified under the heading of natural philosophy. But I digress. The point here is that the role of thought experiments stretched beyond philosophy itself. Thought experiments do not always ask us to imagine wild and far-out scenarios. Indeed, some may not ask us to stretch our imaginations that far at all. Sometimes thought experiments might ask you to imagine something as mundane as, what ought I do morally if I were to find out that one of my friends were cheating on another? Such a situation, unfortunately, isn't especially uncommon. But not all thought experiments involve such standard and readily believable premises. Sometimes they require that we imagine things that are a bit out of the ordinary, and sometimes students balk when thought experiments ask them to imagine something that seems entirely out of the realm of reasonable possibility. Consider something like the following. Imagine an alien race from another planet that has, after a long journey, made it to Earth. Further imagine that this species is just as intelligent as human beings are, has a society just like human beings do, and display the same kind of emotions and so forth, or at least seem to in terms of their behavior. Now imagine that these aliens are composed of what we think of as completely inorganic materials. Of course, these aliens find the composition of life on our planet quite strange as well. The aliens visit Earth because their planet's sun has begun emitting powerful flares and their planet is in trouble. They need a new place to live. Their technology is superior to our own, but we have an entire planet and they only have a few hundred ships. If it came to war, it would be difficult to say who would win. A war like this has never been fought in either the aliens' history or in our own. Among the Earth leaders there are those, let's call them the Hawks, who are confident that we can win this battle. They believe that using nuclear weapons to create an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse, would destroy the alien central nervous system. It would do a great deal of financial damage to human beings, but cost us very few lives. If this was successful, the war could be won rather quickly. Indeed, one major advantage to this tactic is that we could then recover much of the alien technology. But there are also the doves among the Earthlings, and the doves object that these aliens just want a place to live, and that they are living, feeling beings as well, just like us. Killing them essentially is killing a person. What is more, we are talking about genocide. The Hawks just scoff at this. They say that the aliens do not have organic brains, that no matter how much they may appear to behave or appear to show emotions, they do not actually feel them. So it would not be immoral to do anything we want to them, whether it is kill them, imprison them, or vivisect them alive to see how they work. The Hawks argue that the alien brains are just machines or evolved computers that dumbly follow the laws of physics. These inorganic brains, they argue, cannot actually experience pain, fear, love, joy, or anything else any more than we typically believe our smartphones can. The doves, however, argue that just because the brains of the aliens are made out of different material, that is no reason to treat them differently. To do so would be a type of bigotry. We know the same thing about the aliens regarding their conscious lives as we do about each other. We know about their behavior. We cannot look inside of each other and tell if the person sitting next to ourselves is conscious, organic brain or not. Ultimately, what we have to look at is the fine-grained functionality of the brain and the behavior produced by it. Humans have looked at the brains of the aliens and know that they function in the same basic way as our own do. We also know that they act and behave in the same basic way as human beings do. That is to say that the aliens seem to exhibit the same types of behaviors that we associate with rich internal lives. So the reasonable assumption for us to make, or so argue the doves, is that the aliens have the same kinds of conscious lives that we do. Among the aliens, there are hawks and doves as well. The alien hawks believe that they can modify an Earth virus to decimate the population, leaving the rest of the Earth and the infrastructure intact. They can send the virus down to Earth and hang around out of reach of any weaponry until it does its work. The alien doves make the same objection that the Earth doves do. They say that the Earthlings are people just like they are, and so killing them would be mass murder and genocide. But like the Earth hawks, the alien hawks scoff at this. They argue, as the Earth hawks did, that the Earth brains are not made of the same materials as their own. They argue that their own brains produce emotions, feelings, and so forth, but they do not have any reason to believe that the weird molecules that make up human brains do anything of the kind. Meat brains are just biological computers as the hawks see it. Humans can produce behavior that looks as if it displays emotions and feelings, but really human brains are just following the dumb laws of chemistry and have no real experiences at all. Okay, so now this is a far-out scenario. I not only asked you to imagine that aliens visit the Earth, I asked you to imagine a very specific set of aliens who react in a very specific way, and also that human beings act in a very specific way. A student might very well argue that the odds of anything like this happening are about as good as winning the lottery while getting struck by lightning, just as one is discovering buried treasure while at the very same time being elected President of the United States. In other words, a student may ask why we are spending time discussing something that is never going to happen, and for this reason sometimes students are tempted to tune out thought experiments like these. But, as we will see, that is missing the point. It is missing the point because the thought experiment we just discussed isn't about preparing for an alien invasion. If we were actually worried about such an invasion, yes, we would indeed be wasting our time. But that isn't the purpose of the experiment. Instead, the thought experiment is designed to test our reasoning and intuitions regarding the source of conscious experiences. We'll see more about this later. But before that, the most useful way to understand thought experiments is perhaps through a direct analogy to empirical experiments in the sciences. That is to say, experiments of exactly the same type that you would find scientists conducting in a laboratory. Suppose you were a research psychologist and you wanted to know if high temperatures of a certain range were correlated to aggression in mice, with the hopes of seeing if this generalizes to other mammals and perhaps humans. But mice first. Science progresses in steps. So how would you test for this? Well, experiments typically have at least one test group and one control group. So one way to test this might be to place a dozen or so mice in one cage at normal room temperature, say 78 degrees, and another group in a cage kept at 99 degrees. One can then count the incidence of aggression and see if the hotter or cooler cage has more aggression and whether or not this difference is statistically significant. But this is not yet enough for a good experiment. Suppose that you put 6 mice in one cage but 10 mice in another. If you do that, then any change in aggression might have to do with population. Suppose that you place one cage in a place where there is light 20 hours a day and another in an area where there is normal light cycles. In that case, the change in light exposure might be causing any change in behavior. We don't want that variable affecting the experiment either. Or suppose that the mice in one cage were of one species and the mice in another cage were of another. Here we have brown mice in one cage and white mice in another. Genetics is important. Laboratory mice are deliberately inbred to the point of being near genetic clones of one another precisely for the purpose of doing better experimentation. We really need to be careful of everything. There might be a generator next to one cage that disturbs one group of mice with noise, or one group might receive a breeze while others do not, or one group might get more water or different kinds of food, or more handling from the researchers, or have more toys in their cage. Scientists try to control for all of these things. So here's what the cages may look like after trying to control for more of these variables. But why is variable control so important, and what could this possibly have to do with thought experiments? It is just this: a laboratory experiment allows the researchers to keep as many variables constant as possible except for what the scientists are testing. If the cages are identical size, have identical mice, given identical opportunities to eat, exposed to identical noise and human contact, and so on, for every major variable, the more variables that are controlled for, the more sure we can be that any statistically different result is the result of the one variable we changed, in this case temperature. Of course, this is one of the reasons why the process of peer review is so important in science. Often scientists forget to control for a key variable, or run a test in such a way that the effect could have been caused by multiple things. For example, the experiment we just described above might sound like we took everything into account, but what if one group of mice had a different ratio of females to males? If mice fight over mating, this could definitely result in aggression. At this point, the similarity between thought experiments and laboratory experiments should be becoming clearer. What they both do is attempt to keep all the variables the same, except for what the experimenter is trying to test for. The scientist is usually trying to test for results that are empirically measurable by instruments or directly with the senses, while philosophers are usually trying to test for intuition, logical consistency, or to see what further conclusions are required if a premise or principle is accepted. Though it is worth noting that there are those who engage in experimental philosophy which uses empirical measurements as well. Notice how little it would mean to say how unrealistic the mouse experiment is. But this objection could be made. After all, what are the odds of finding mice living in nature sharing such exact conditions? These two groups of mice are in the same number, have the same kinds of food and same amount of water, are exposed to the same amounts of light and noise and other distractions. They have the same air quality. Indeed, the mice are near genetic copies of one another. Write down the list, variable after variable. It's the same between the two groups, except for the single variable of temperature. A student of the same mind who objected to the thought experiment with aliens might make the same objection here. This is just never going to happen in nature. One would have a better chance of discovering a million-year-old ancient city underneath LA during an earthquake and finding out that it contains a giant golden statue of my own likeness than that ever happening. Seriously, the odds of having two groups of mice nearly genetically identical alone would be astronomically small. But making this objection would miss the point. While it is true that two groups of mice are exceedingly unlikely to ever live in almost identical except for one variable conditions in the wild, this objection misses the point of the experiment entirely. The point of the experiment wasn't to simulate something that is going to happen in the real world. The point of the experiment was to test to see if temperature was linked to increased or reduced aggression. Whether or not it is even the case that aliens exist is just as irrelevant to our concern as it is to the scientist whether or not there are populations of mice out there in the real world that exactly duplicate the control and test conditions in her experiment. Thought experiments and laboratory experiments are alike in this respect. They're controlling for individual variables by setting up what are often unrealistic cases. What variables are we keeping the same in our thought experiment, and what are we changing? Let's consider it again. We had humans and we had aliens, each made out of different stuff. Humans are made out of the normal organic meat stuff that we are used to, while the aliens are composed of what we normally consider inorganic compounds. All we know about the situation is the behavior of the humans and the aliens. The human hawks argue that aliens are like machines that do not feel anything, while the human doves argue that they are non-human people. Likewise, the alien hawks argue that human brains are just meat machines and that they do not feel anything, while the alien doves argue that humans are non-alien people. The variable being changed here is what the brains are made out of. Everything else is kept the same. The fine-grained functionality of the brain, the behavior that seems to indicate conscious experience, and so forth. Both groups behave exactly as people do. The aliens speak, strategize, and develop technology and culture and art and so forth, just as humans do. The question that one is being forced to consider, however, is whether or not the aliens can be conscious if their brains are made out of different stuff. Suppose that you side with the human doves. This essentially means that you're saying that you believe that what is important isn't what a brain is made out of, but how it functions, and the behavior it produces. This might have important implications for AI as we simulate larger and larger brains. Siding with the Hawks also has implications. Of course, the purpose of today's lecture isn't to settle any issues about consciousness, but rather to show how such thought experiments can have value. Of course, these are not purely idle considerations either. IBM has announced that it has plans to create a neural network that will simulate the same number of neurons as the human brain has, and believes it can do so by 2021. If you take them seriously, thought experiments can become a useful tool in your toolbox. They are not only of interest to philosophers. Science is filled with the use of such thought experiments. When scientists do experiments like those with the mice described earlier, they are doing empirical research. But when Einstein asked himself what it would be like to travel at the speed of light, this wasn't a laboratory experiment. He was performing a thought experiment. When Darwin asked what would happen if a varied population with the ability to pass on traits continued reproducing in an environment where those traits could affect their reproductive success, he too was engaging in a thought experiment. Nor are these two isolated cases. Thought experiments are used in a wide variety of fields, from physics to chemistry to astrophysics to computer science to psychology and psychiatry, and many, many more. I've taken the time to present this lecture to you because, since this is a philosophy course, we will likely be looking at numerous thought experiments throughout the semester, and it is important not to be thrown by the fantastical nature that some of them take. Until next time.